So we're continuing on with Frederick Thorpe's testimony. He's a former post office investigator, and it's quite interesting with the role that he had. So he had a role managing North East England, and then when two other people retired and there was no other suitable candidates, he also took over his same role, but also covering Scotland and Northern Ireland without, by his admission, any knowledge really of the legal differences there, which is obviously quite crucial in both the McKelvey and McLaughlin cases that took place in Scotland and Ireland, Northern Ireland respectively. However, the most damning thing appears to be that there was a post office legal services team that they'd contact for help, but he says they didn't know. They said they couldn't help with the law in the jurisdictions that they were operating. Let's jump into the inquiry.
And you then explain in your statement at paragraph 10 that when this vacancy arose, so the investigation manager vacancy, there was no one who was suitably qualified to fill that vacancy, as almost all of the investigators had been part of the post office investigation department, which at that point had been disbanded. Is that correct?
What had happened when it was disbanded, the respective investigators had been moved into Royal Mail or post office counters. Not everybody seemed to be happy with their allotted business, and one of the investigators put into post office counters in Leeds didn't like the job. Well, he liked the job, but he transferred to Royal Mail at the first opportunity, and there were no other suitably qualified ex-POID officers available. And I was asked, would I like to do the job, subject to an assessment to see whether I had the right capabilities.
So it wasn't then that the ex-POID officers were unsuitable in so much as they were unqualified to fill the new vacancy, but they'd already been allocated to different roles, is that right?
I think it was because they'd been allocated different roles in a different business rather than the lack of qualifications.
That's an interesting there that he mentions some kind of assessment for the suitability of a role of investigation manager. That's the first time I think we've heard an investigation manager bring that up. It will be interesting to see what the criteria of this assessment were. Is it similar to the subpostmaster assessment that they do when they're recruiting subpostmasters, as in someone vouching for you, almost like a reference? That remains to be seen at the moment.
And how was your suitability for that role assessed?
Well, I had to come to London for an interview with the ex-head of Post Office Investigations, and also there was a psychiatrist available who did a psychiatric evaluation. Following the interview, then my boss in Leeds was told they felt I was suitable, subject to being able to arrange some training. There wasn't a formal training course available at that time.
So can I just stop you there, just to go back to the evaluation? And what did you understand the purpose of the psychiatric evaluation to be?
To be quite honest, I wasn't quite sure whether it was, I don't know, to decide whether I was too gung-ho to go charging into investigating people, or I wasn't sure. It was just something that was thrown in when I was interviewed for the job.
If that was what it was for, then I think we could describe possibly some of the behaviour we've seen from other people that they've described as being a bit gung-ho, so possibly wasn't all that effective, or was for a different purpose.
And did you understand that to be common practice? Did other investigators undergo psychiatric evaluation?
Well, I don't know anything about the recruitment process for the POID officers as they were then, so I'm not sure whether that was part of their initiation or sort of initial interview. I'm not sure.
Were you told what the results of that psychiatric evaluation was?
Well, I assume it was okay because I got the job, but I didn't get a formal feedback from it, no.
So is it right then you believe you were the first person to be recruited since the Post Office Investigation Department was disbanded as an investigator?
I believe at that time I was, but that's my belief. I may be wrong because obviously the Post Office spread over throughout the UK, but I believe I was the first one to go through it.
And so in 1996, what geographical areas were you responsible for?
1996, it was, I was based on Leeds, but my area was the northeast from the Hull up to the Scottish borders, and bordered in by the Pennines. So the very northeast section of England.
And then is it right that following the retirement of 2 officers in Scotland and Northern Ireland in 2000 that you also became responsible for those regions?
Well, my boss at that time said, "You're the nearest. Would you like to do the job?" And that was basically it. And I said, "Okay." So I shadowed the outgoing POID officer in Scotland, and
do you remember who that was?
it was a man called Peter Webb. He'd formerly been a senior manager within POID.
And did you also mentor someone, the person who had been responsible for Northern Ireland?
I don't know. I never met them. I don't know who they were. So.
And do you know why those individuals weren't replaced? So why another person wasn't sent to Scotland and another person wasn't sent to Northern Ireland, rather than you being asked to take over those roles?
Well, I was doing the investigation role in the northeast of England. I don't know what efforts were made to find somebody else to do that area. I don't know. Geographically, I was the nearest person to take it over.
Which is fair enough because he's been asked there. But again, just as we saw with Elaine Cottam and the 112 post office, I think it was, that she was managing, that seems like a massive area to have responsibility for. The northeast of England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. If it was 3 jobs before, why didn't it remain 3 jobs? This must have somebody stretched quite a lot, so whether they're capable of applying the appropriate level of detail, particularly when prosecutions are being brought, is questionable in that case.
So is it right then from 2000 until your retirement in 2003 that you managed a team of 4 investigators who were based in Newcastle, Glasgow, Perth and Belfast?
Yes.
And were you still based in the northeast of England throughout that time?
I didn't actually have an office as such, so I used to divide my time between Newcastle and Glasgow, spending more time probably in Glasgow than I did in Newcastle.
And were you ever based in Belfast throughout that time?
No. Traditionally, going back POID days, there was only ever one officer in Belfast. And so what would happen, the investigator was Suzanne Winter, and I would fly over probably once a month, more often if there was a need for it, which sometimes there was. But so Glasgow was a good base for me.
So Suzanne Winter was one of the post office investigators that we heard from last week who was involved in the Maureen McKelvey case.
And so, as you said, the manager in Belfast was Suzanne Winter, who the inquiry heard from last Friday. That's right?
Yes, I believe so.
And then the manager based in Perth was Raymond Grant, who the inquiry also heard from last week. Was it Raymond Grant who you managed?
Raymond Grant was the officer in Perth, yes.
So then was part of your role supervising the day-to-day conduct of investigations in Northern Ireland?
Well, Suzanne would do that. Basically, we were a small team, and although I had the title team leader, there was enough work to keep everybody active, including myself. So rather than being sort of sitting in a desk managing, I was sort of active as well. So all activities in Northern Ireland were conducted by Suzanne Winter. In Scotland, it depended. There wasn't a geographical split, so Shirley Stockdale or Raymond Grant would pick up the work wherever it was within Scotland. And in the northeast of England, the officer there, I would support him if necessary, or if I was unavailable, then somebody from the northeast team, based in Leeds, excuse me, would go and support him.
I mean, that could well be true, but is that a bit of an attempt to pass the buck as say, although I was called team leader, I wasn't really managing them on a day-to-day basis? certainly in the case of Suzanne Winter and Raymond Grant, seems to be almost suggesting it's arm's length and they manage themselves, which could explain some of the oversight issues we've previously wondered about during their testimony to the Post Office inquiry last week.
So did you have any supervisory function in Northern Ireland with Miss Winter's investigations?
Well, I was her supervisor as such, so any work that she undertook, we would discuss as a team rather than leaving her out there on a limb. Yeah.
And before 2000, when you took responsibility for Northern Ireland, did you have any experience of conducting investigations there yourself?
No, not in Northern Ireland or Scotland, no.
When you took on the role, did you appreciate the differences in how the legal systems and processes worked in Northern Ireland and Scotland?
Not until I moved there, no. I did speak to... oh, excuse me.
So that's probably quite critical, really, isn't it? Because actually we've seen the difference in law and how the cases are taken on and the differences between that in England. So that probably hampers your ability to effectively supervise what the managers below you are doing.
Post Office Legal Services for advice, but the advice was they don't know. That they weren't fully up to speed on Irish and Scottish law to be able to advise.
Surely that's a problem. If Post Office Legal Services sounds like their legal department, surely they've got to have people that are across not only in the law in all jurisdictions that they're operating in, which at this time would have been not only England but also Scotland and Northern Ireland.
So it became quite a steep learning curve for Suzanne and myself to learn how to process cases to the prosecution.
So
partly because previously we'd been able to deal directly with the DPP, Director of Public Prosecutions.
So we'll come on to that, but just back to your point about whenever you first took on the role, you didn't really have experience in Northern Ireland,
no.
And you sought advice from Post Office Legal Services.
Yeah.
Do you remember who that was in Post Office Legal Services?
Well, I had a lot of dealings with Rob Wilson, but I can't say for certain that it was Rob Wilson that actually said we can't help.
Okay.
But I sort of remember him from my days in England.